Hi guys, welcome to lecture 2.1. We're going to be talking about variables, conceptualization, and operationalization today. Now, while these terms might not sound familiar to you now, I promise that they are common sense, and I'm going to do my best to put them in simplistic terms so that you understand where these things fit within the whole research process. All right, let's get started. Okay, so we've got this idea of variables. Now what variables mean are the things that we are researching. Remember when I gave you that definition of what research is? It's essentially how things are interconnected, how things are related, and those things we tend to call variables. And this means that they can vary in one direction or another, vary by category, things like vary by age. So we tend to call the elements that we're researching variables. Now this will make an appearance again once we talk about causation, because determining independent and dependent variables are very important when we talk about causal relationships. Now what's an independent variable? All right, when we're researching, we tend to say that independent variables are things that maybe we don't have control over. This could be our age. This might be a person's gender. This could be the number of years of school a person finished. And that independent variable can be changed, varied, or manipulated to test the effects of a dependent variable. Okay, so we might not have control over all of our independent variables like age, but we can vary them to some effect. And we might say the dependent variables change because of independent variables. Okay, I know that sounds pretty complicated. So let me explain it a little bit more simply. Let's talk about the dependent variable. Now you'll usually see this in lecture slides and in books. It might be shortened with dV, and the same thing with independent variable you might see as IV, all right? Now the dependent variable can also be called the variable of interest. In criminology, we might tend to think of levels of crime, or the likelihood of a person committing a homicide, or recidivism as a dependent variable. And we want to know how other things can influence those variables. The other things would be our independent variables, like age, like number of years spent in prison, like type of punishment given out by the court. Okay, and we're going to say those things can have an effect on dependent variables. So the dV would be the thing that we're wanting to measure. We can also call this an outcome, a variable of interest. So it's the thing that we're really interested in a study. Now, if there is a relationship between the IV and the dV, we will see the dV change because of the introduction or dependent upon the IV. All right, I know that sounds like a whole lot, but simply put, if we're thinking causal, the independent variable can cause a change in the dependent variable. All right? And if we have perfect experimental conditions, the independent variable is the one that's being controlled by the researcher. Or even if we don't have control over it, we can put it into categories and see how those categories affect the outcome or the dependent variable. Now, it's important to remember the three following things. The dependent variable in an experiment will only change if there is a relationship between the IV and the dV, there is a change in the IV, and the independent variable must come before the dependent variable. So if we say something like lightning causes thunder, we have to know that the two things are related. So that means every time you hear thunder, lightning had to have happened. So we know they go together, and we know that lightning always comes first. So we know as soon as there's lightning, thunder is going to be the outcome. All right? Very simple way to put an independent and a dependent variable. However, when it comes to criminology and studying human behavior, things tend to get a lot more complicated. Let me show you this graph and see if it helps kind of get things clearer in your mind. An independent variable affects change in the dependent variable. Okay? The IV has to happen first, and the dependent variable has to be the outcome. All right? Let's talk about some examples here. Let's say we have a research question. Remember, we talked about research questions last week. Are Indigenous people, compared to non-Indigenous people, visited less in prison? Okay? So, the thing I'm interested in measuring, the outcome variable I'm really interested in would be the dependent variable, and that would be number of visits in prison. This is what we're measuring, okay? So that's why it is the dependent variable. And according to my research question, I'm saying, is that dependent variable? Are the numbers of visits within a prison, is that dependent upon Indigenous status? So in my equation here, Indigenous status would be our independent variable, and the dependent variable would be number of visits in prison. Okay? I don't know if these things are directly related, but this is a great research question. And we could say, if I broke my sample into two groups, do those who are Indigenous have fewer or more, or about the same number of visits as those who are non-Indigenous? Okay, so that's one example. Let's talk about another here. For a research question like, can the history of serious mental illness predict whether young people will come into contact with the criminal justice system? Let's break it down into smaller pieces. What am I actually looking at? I'm looking at two elements here, or two variables. One would be my independent variable, and I'm saying that's the one that's going to cause a change in the outcome. And the second would be my outcome variable. Sometimes it's easier to start with that one and identify it, and then say, well, what am I saying is affecting that? So in this research example, my dependent variable would be contact with the criminal justice system, okay? I might say contact could be arrest, it could be incarceration, it could be getting a ticket, it could be getting a notice to appear. So basically any sort of formal contact with police officers, with the courts, justice system in general, all right? And what am I saying do I think affects that? In this research equation, I'm saying people who have a history of serious mental illness. Now you'll also see up here in that research question, you might be able to pick out another independent variable. I mentioned the word young people. So age could possibly be another independent variable, all right? But it's not the one I'm completely interested in studying. I'm interested in looking at a singular variable, history of mental illness, and will it have an effect on contact with the criminal justice system, okay? So again, we have to think what comes first in time to have an effect on the other variable we're looking at in our research equation. The independent variable has to come first to affect the dependent variable. And sometimes when we're looking at these, the dependent variable is going to be the one easier to pick out, okay? Now, backing it up just a little bit, how do we get to the point where we have variables within a research equation? When we have a research question, how do we know exactly what we're talking about? What is crime? What is recidivism? Well, we have to start at the concept stage, okay? Now, you might have all sorts of ideas or concepts about how the world works. We tend to think that these sorts of concepts are abstract in our minds. They exist purely in our minds, And what I think is a concept might be a bit different to you, okay? An idea of a concept could be love. All right, what is love to one person and what is love to somebody else? All right, it's an abstract idea. I can't see it. I can't touch it. I can't record it on a piece of paper. I just know what it is. All right. Now, usually there's pretty general agreement about what a particular concept means. However, when we do research, remember, we have to go way above. We have to go beyond what's just on the surface and really define what it is we mean. And we call that process conceptualization. So we're taking a concept that we have in our minds, contact with the justice system, history of mental illness, and we have to really provide a concrete definition of what that concept means to us, or more essentially, what that concept means to a research study. Okay, so if I just said, I want to study crime, well, that could mean a million different things. Do I mean delinquency? Do I mean deviant behavior? Do I mean things that you're arrested for? Do I mean things that go unreported? Or do I only mean homicide? Okay, so when we do research studies, we need to be very careful and clearly conceptualize what we mean. All right, so once we conceptualize, we can turn that into a variable. And that's how we get variables. So we have to start at the big thinking stage in order to get to the research equation stage. All right? Now, think about these. How would you conceptualize the following concepts? Violence, youth, happy, or a friend? I think we could come up with a number of different ways that what we mean by those words, okay? Does violence have to be physical contact between two people? Or can violence be verbal? Can violence be economic or emotional? So if we're doing a study on violence, we need to be super specific about what we mean, and that whole process is called conceptualizing, all right? I'm conceptualizing what I mean and turning it into a defined variable, okay? Now, there's not really any one correct definition for concepts. If I say crime, well, if we have 28 people in the class, we could come up with 28 definitions of what we mean by crime. Depending on how we conceptualize these items or how we define them, the right way depends on how we want to research them, okay? So if I'm taking the variable reoffending, okay, I need to explicitly state what that means when I'm doing a research study, because there's no one right way to do it. It's how I want to do it and how it's going to be expressed in my study. Let's look at a couple of different ways here. One way we could express the concept of reoffending means somebody has to commit a crime the first time. That's your primary offense. And then when anyone ever breaks the law after the very first time, that would be reoffending. It's like if you speed in a car, all right? First time you speed, primary offense. Every single time you speed after that, that would be reoffending. I think we can all identify with that one, right? Another definition or another conceptualization of reoffending could look like this. When anyone commits a new offense after being released from prison. Okay, so this is implying something completely different. It doesn't mean you've broken the law once and you go on with your life. This means you've broken the law, you go to prison, and then once you get out, any offense you commit after that is looked at as reoffending. But it's only applying to a particular population here, people who have already been to prison. So again, that changes the focus. Imagine if you're doing a study, that might completely change who would go into your sample, okay? A third way we could explore the concept of reoffending might be looking at adults who are convicted of a new offense after being found guilty of an offense previously. So that means they don't just have to break the law, they have to break the law, get caught, get taken to court, and convicted. So that's going to narrow the number of people I could have in my study by a lot. Okay? And again, we can further define exactly what we mean, and it always has to go to what is the primary purpose of your research study. What is the exact thing you are interested in? Okay, and the more specific, the better. Now, I'm not saying you want to get so specific when you're only looking at 15-year-old boys named Trevor. Okay, that would be far too specific. But you don't want to be so broad, you're saying anybody who ever commits an offense after the first offense. That would be far too broad. Okay? Conceptualization happens when we're defining what a variable means for a specific research project. All the articles that you read in this class, you will be able to see how the researchers have conceptualized their variables. And I hope you find it really interesting and you're able to pick these things out as we go along. Okay, once we're done getting some things on paper, getting our ideas out there and spelling out exactly what we mean by a concept, we call this a conceptual definition. Okay, has to be comprehensive, it has to be clear, and it has to be accurately reflecting the underlying concept. All right? Now, again, they're going to look different for every researcher. So each study that you read, if they're exploring similar topics like drug abuse, read specifically how they define it. How are they conceptualizing that variable? All right? Does it mean drugs like heroin and cocaine, methamphetamine? Or are they talking about any kind of drug use, marijuana, prescription drugs? It can really change the scope of a study. Okay. Now, we've got our conceptual definition. We know exactly what we mean when we say blank. We know exactly what we mean when we say reoffending. Okay. The second part I have to do is figure out, now how the heck am I going to set that variable up to be measured or to fit within a study? How can I operationalize this variable? Now, Microsoft might not agree with you, but the term operationalize is a word, okay? So trust me on this. Operationalization is essentially how are we going to measure each concept we want to put into our study, okay? Now, again, just like conceptualization, operationalization can be done in a number of different ways. There's no one right way to operationalize a variable. Let me give you an example of what we mean when we say operationalize. Let's take the concept of poverty. We can say things like people who grew up in poverty are more likely to have contact with the justice system at some point in their adult lives. Well, what do we mean by poverty? If we're doing a research study, we need to be super specific so that we can decide what goes in to our data and what is left out. Because we don't want anything to confound it, and we don't want to say, well, I found this data, but it didn't exactly fit. We want things to exactly fit our research questions. All right, let's take the idea of poverty. Now, in our heads, we might know what we mean with that concept. All right, one way we could conceptualize it or put it on paper would be like this. Poverty means not having enough money to live. Okay, well, I know a lot of college students and a lot of university students and graduate students, for that instance, who don't always make enough money to live or live like the way they want to live. But does that mean they're in poverty? Well, maybe not, because they're getting access to higher education. So maybe we could further conceptualize that and go a little bit farther and maybe make it more sociological in nature. So how about this? Poverty could mean not having access to the living standards customary in your society, which might mean having a stable home or a stable place to live. It might mean not having enough food for 3 meals a day. It could mean not having things like toys or a working telephone or electricity or water. So that paints a very different picture than my first conceptualization attempt. Not having access to living standards customary in your society. All right, I think we might go with that one. I like how that sounds. Now, how can we operationalize that? So if I put that into a research study and I'm trying to decide, are people in poverty or are they not in poverty? Who am I going to include and who am I going to exclude? This is where that operational definition really comes into play. One way I could operationalize my variable here is, I could say, the way I'm going to measure poverty is I'm going to look at a person's income in dollars after tax. If that's less than $500 a month, they're below the poverty line. Okay, but again, I think there are plenty of single parents, university students, graduate students, young people out there who might fit that definition. But if I go back to my other conceptual definition, maybe not. Okay, now, another way I could operationalize it that might really capture what I'm trying to capture by the concept of poverty would be lacking 3 or more from a list of objects and activities most people have access to, like those things we discussed. So I could create a checklist and say, do you have access to these things on a regular basis? And if they don't, boom, that's how I'm measuring poverty or not in poverty. Okay? Now, this allows us to measure variables. So even though in our heads we think we know what we're talking about, when it comes to doing a research study, we have to be super specific so that everybody else that reads it could possibly replicate it or could compare their study to ours and go, oh my gosh, we totally found similar results. Okay? Now, it can allow other people to replicate, and that's very important for reasons we'll talk about later in the trimester, because we want to be able to say, my idea, my hypothesis, my research question is important, and we found it over and over and over again. That means it's not an anomaly or it's not a fluke. That is a proven and evidence-based idea. Okay? Let's look at this one. All right? If our research question goes like this, is earning potential based on height? What is the variable I'm trying to measure? Well, I mean, technically both. I'm trying to measure a person's height and I'm trying to measure their earning potential. But which one is the variable of interest? Aha, I'm interested in measuring how much a person can earn over their lifetime. And is height a predictor for that? So this situation would mean in my equation, my independent variable would be height. And I say that will affect my dependent variable, which would be earning potential. Now, what I mean by height is how tall a person is. And I could break that down into attributes. So giving it an operational definition might look like this. I'm going to classify a person as tall if they're over 6 feet or 180 centimeters. Okay. I'm going to classify a person as short if they're under 5 feet. Okay, well, what about all the people who are between 5 foot and 6 foot? Aha, I'm going to classify them as average. So now if I put a whole lot of subjects in my sample, I can break them into 3 different groups. my independent variable groups, and see if their height is related to their earnings potential. And I might find that taller people over their life earn more money, okay? That's why it's super important that we operationalize what we mean when we say height, when we say earnings potential, okay? So to recap, 3 specific types of variables are used in research. Our dependent variables, I always think that's the one that we can find most easily, all right? That's the one that is the focus of our research. That's our variable of interest. It is dependent upon other variables, all right? The independent variable. This is the one that I'm saying will influence or predict or cause a change in my dependent variable. And this could be something that I don't have control over, like height. A person can't change their height, maybe with high heels on, but you can't make yourself grow. Birthplace. Were you born in Australia or not born in Australia? These sorts of things could be independent variables that predict something else. And finally, our third type of variable used in research, we call control variables. Now, they are a type of independent variables. That means they're not tied to our dependent variable at all. They might not be tied to anything. Eye color and hair color might not be tied together, but they do exist as independent variables. They're not the focus of my research, but as a researcher, I want to do my due diligence and control for them, okay? Sometimes we call these demographic variables. Sometimes we call them background variables. A lot of control variables, very commonly race, gender, full-time, part-time, or non-working status, these sorts of things that we want to control for because they could have an effect, but it's just not exactly what I'm trying to research, all right? And if we control for them, it can help isolate our primary independent variables to see if we have an effect there. Now, why do we need control variables? Well, let's look at a graph like this. If we're looking at one specific subject, say her name is Barbara, and we want to measure something like parenting stress, and is that related to mental health? Or the other way around, does mental health predict parenting stress? I might say parenting stress can definitely affect your mental health. Our graph might look like this. The gray line would be mental health levels, okay? And we could, in a study, we would perfectly operationalize this so the reader would know exactly how we're measuring it. And our red line could be parenting stress, all right? So we can see trends. Things go up and down over a period of 9 years. So do these two lines cross over? Do they predict a change in one of the other? Well, I might have to say we need to consider some of the other things going on in Barbara's life. What about getting married? What about having more than one child? What about getting a job? People dying in a person's life. They can all affect your parental stress and your mental health levels. So if we control for these, perhaps I can more likely isolate the effect of parenting stress on mental health by controlling for those other variables, those control variables, as we say. Let me give you an example of some other control variables, okay? If we've got a hypothesis like this, women who are older are more likely to experience parenting stress. Well, obviously in that situation, we would say age. Age would be our control variable. Now, it's not my primary variable in the study. I'm not completely interested in how age affects parenting stress, okay? I'm interested in parenting stress and mental health, but I'm controlling for age. Women who have more children, women who are employed. And then a results section might look like this. After controlling for age, number of children, and employment, the imprisonment of a close family member still increases parenting stress. Again, there's a lot to explore when it comes to research, and I hope that you'll enjoy the journey that we're going to take you on. So, independent, dependent, control variables, and how we get there through the process of conceptualizing and operationalizing these variables. It's the big takeaway from today.